It is said that deep in our forests there lurks giant, hairy, bipedal creatures. Almost on a daily basis, hikers, hunters, general adventurers, and law enforcement officials have stumbled across these strange creatures. Many times giant tracks, footprints are left. More often than not, the witnesses are left frightened and stunned following the encounter. If you believe some of the researchers, they might even be responsible for many of the people who go missing every year in our woods. In this video, I will look at some lesser-known cases involving encounters with the creature known as Bigfoot, Sasquatch. For a boy in California, his encounter with 3 creatures at a river would give way to a revelation of a bizarre kidnapping. The witness does not reveal a specific date for the encounter. However, if it's true, it does suggest that some of the Bigfoot researchers who proclaim the creatures as benign might not be entirely accurate. The witness, a Native American man who was only a boy at the time, recalled that he'd set off for a fishing trip with his grandfather. It was a 3-day hike into the forest. The river they went to forked to the west and towards the south. They always went to the west fork for some reason. On this day, the witness woke early. His grandfather was still sleeping, so he decided to head on down to the south fork for a morning hike. As he reached the area, he began to hear talking and loud splashing. The area was extremely remote. Nobody ventured out there, and for this reason, it piqued the interest of the witness. He decided to go and investigate. His hike to the south fork would suddenly take a very strange turn. The voices got louder and weirder. I thought poachers were there, and they'll shoot anyone who catches them, so I hid in the trees and crept up. I saw 3 big, hairy men fishing. According to the witness, there were 4 of them in total. 3 large males, and what looked like to him a leaner, smaller female standing on the shore. He claims that one was in the water up to his waist, hitting the water with his hands cupped together, causing a big blast of water to shoot up. When he did that, fish would fly up, and the other 2 males, who were also in the water but closer to the shore, would grab them. They were fast and accurate, he recalled. From there, the 2 would throw the fish up on the bank where the female picked them up and stuffed them into what looked like a huge tumbleweed or a round wad of woven twigs. The witness was completely stunned. I couldn't believe my eyes, he wrote of the encounter. At some point, the creatures ceased their activity. Almost in unison, they looked over in the direction of the witness and then scrambled off into the forest. Despite their size, the witness was impressed by how graceful their walking was, almost cat-like, soft and swift. When he returned to his camp, his grandfather was awake and was calling for him. I ran up to him and he looked at me. He said, "You saw them, didn't you?" I nodded. He said, "That's why we can't go down to the South Fork." He told me I was lucky to be alive and to never go down there again. That is their place, and we don't intrude. Later that day, the grandfather would tell him a strange story about his wife, the witness's grandmother. She had a terrifying run-in with these hairy men in her youth. According to the grandfather, when she was a young girl, she was taken by some of these creatures. She was made to briefly care for the young and work. She was eventually sighted by some people at a waterfall, and the creatures, for some reason, promptly released her. Since there is no specific date or location for this story, it is nearly impossible to do a follow-up on it. This story, if true, is compelling and seems to match other cases like Albert Ostman, in which people were taken by these strange creatures and brought back to their cave or hideout. If the grandmother had not been released, is it possible that she would become just another name in David Paulius' missing 411 books? In January 2016, 2 men looking for a hunting spot in North would come face to face with something they were told doesn't exist. In June 2016, Cryptozoology News was contacted by a 44-year-old man named Alan Coleman regarding an encounter he and his friend had in January in Guilford County. Coleman, now retired, had heard about some land in the Oak Ridge area. He and his friend had decided to go out and scout the spot for the coming hunting season to find out if it was worthwhile. They arrived at around 3:30 p.m. and made their way down to the creek bottom, where they followed it for about 30 minutes. They eventually came upon what they thought would be a good spot for hunting. It was a heavily traveled game trail. Alan and his friend decided to sit down and rest. maybe wait to see if any deer came through. After sitting there for about 5 minutes or so, we heard movement in the thicket. We were sure it was a big buck making its way through, as it was making a lot of noise and sounded as if it was struggling to get through the thicket. As they sat there waiting, Coleman recalled how a strange, uneasy silence came over the area. Suddenly his eyes focused in on something further down the creek about 40 yards away. Something was there, crouched down. My friend, startled to say the least, started to get up when the other one stepped out of the thicket on the creek side. A feeling came over me unlike no feeling I've ever felt. It was instant fear. My heart was pounding and I was trembling. Alan and his friend sat in silence, watching as the creature that had stepped out of the woods casually walked down to the other, which was crouched down. Together, the two creatures continued walking down the creek away from Alan and his friend. One of them was bigger than the other. I didn't notice this until the one crouched stood up. The taller one stopped frequently to look around. When we couldn't see or hear them anymore, we tore down through the woods to my truck and left. Coleman claims the taller one weighed probably 400 pounds and stood around 8 feet tall. It had massive arms and legs and hunched over when it walked. Both of the creatures had brown, shaggy hair, which faded to gray in certain areas. He was certain that if they wanted to, the creatures could have easily run them down and killed them. While the creatures Coleman and his friend encountered were harmless, it's not always that way, as evidenced by an encounter sent to paranormal investigator Stephen Wagner for his website, paranormalabout.com. In 2003, the witness Matt, who was at the time 12 or 13 years old, recalled how he had gone out camping in the woods one weekend with a friend. While it is not indicated in the story, given their age, it's a question if the two teens were camping on property that belonged to one of their parents. Anyway, at some point in the night, Matt recalled how they got tired and decided to turn into their tent to sleep. At around 1 a.m., Matt and his friend were awakened by the sound of something walking around outside their camp. It even scraped up alongside their tent at times. My friend and I were scared, understandably, so we talked about what we should do. Just as we put on our shoes, the thing picked up our tent, ripping the stakes right out of the ground and dropped us hard, 4 feet from where we were before. We jumped out of our tent ready to take the thing on, and it was dead quiet. We couldn't see a thing. The teens stood outside the tent looking around the forest for something. The clouds would give way to the moon, and they were finally able to see it. According to the witness, it stood 7 feet tall. It ran up a huge hill away from the campsite. The two teens chased after it. As they were about halfway up the hill, the creature jumped from the top of the hill and ran into a small nearby forest. As the teens stood watching, trying to catch their breath, they saw something truly bizarre, a strange light in the tree line. The witness described it as a craft. It lifted out of the trees and took off into the darkened sky. The two teenagers climbed to the top of the hill and sat there in complete shock over what had happened. In 2013, Holton, Maine was the setting for a similar encounter with a strange, tall entity following the sighting of a UFO. On June 21, 2013, a family in Holton, Maine watched as 7 orbs moved across the sky from the southwest and the northeast. Witness estimated that they were moving 600 to 1,000 miles per hour. No sound could be heard. Behind those 7 orbs came 5 more orbs at the same altitude and speed. All 12 did a corkscrew curve move into a huge thunderhead. They accelerated quickly into the cloud. After that, it downpoured like I've never seen before, only 2 minutes, then the weather turned beautiful. The entire sighting lasted about 5 minutes. Later that night, the witness was in their backyard sitting under the stars stoking a small fire. They heard what sounded like footsteps in the neighbor's backyard and decided to go say hello. As they peered over the hedge into the neighbor's yard, they were greeted with the sight of something weird. I stood up and went over past the hedge in my yard and on the border of my neighbor's yard and the next yard. I saw a figure silhouette in the trees. I saw the head, and it seemed about twice the size of a human head. The figure was all black because of the time of night and the light from the second yard down's window. Whatever the entity was, it had a strange effect on the witness. I felt an intense feeling come over me. not fear, but like it was trying to control my emotions. I whistled and the creature ran away. I heard 5 bipedal footsteps before it ran through the tree line 2 yards down. That is like 50 feet in 5 steps. Almost immediately after the encounter, the witness became ill. Mysterious sickness lasted for about 5 days. Sometime later, when the witness started to feel better, they went over to the area where they had sighted the entity. Using trees in the neighbor's house, they were able to determine that the creature they sighted had to have been at least 7 feet tall. There were other strange events associated with the June 21st encounter that the witness chose not to go into. As with the previous case, it is unclear if the creature the witness sighted was a Bigfoot or something else. Did the fleet of orbs sighted earlier in the day have something to do with the large-headed 7-foot-tall entity sighted later that night, or was it just a coincidence, or possibly a prank? From strange lights and creatures to the men in black. Earlier in the video I mentioned how 2 men encountered a pair of creatures while looking for a hunting spot in Oak Ridge in North Carolina. I failed to mention how Oak Ridge is actually home to the Oak Ridge Military Academy, one of the oldest military academies currently operating in the United States. In some of my previous videos I spoke of various incidents in which Bigfoot was sighted in and around military bases or during combat. In this last case that I will talk about, it not only involved military men sighting a Bigfoot, but also some very strange men who arrived on the scene. In 1999, a man named Fran spoke to Art Bell of Coast to Coast AM about something very bizarre that happened to him back when he was a Marine. It was May 1973. He recalled how he was flown into an area of California known as Casey Spring to conduct a 4-day series of wargame exercises. The location was extremely remote with lots and lots of thick forest. There were no roads leading into the area, and the only way in was by helicopter. Fran claims that on the night in question, he was sent out on a midnight ambush with 15 other men. It was a computerized wargame. It worked on the computer, and so they send Marines out to see if it can be feasibly done. What we did was, we were going after an aggressor force. We set up a linear-shaped ambush, shaped like an L, and when your victims walk into it, it's a computer kill. After setting up the ambush, the men waited. At some point, 2 individuals walked right into their ambush. We opened fire with blanks, and as it turns out, we thought they were bear. So we scrambled, shooting our blanks at these individuals, and they separated. One went one way, and the other went the other way. When they returned to their PPB, platoon-sized patrol base, they immediately informed the lieutenant about what had transpired. He radioed it to the commander, who returned with some very odd orders. After speaking with the commander, the lieutenant informed the men that they were to light a large fire, get a fixed bayonet, and stand around a blazing fire. A very strange order, but one that the men carried out without question. Fran recalled how, all through the night, he and the other men could hear a high-pitched roar coming from somewhere off in the forest. As if things couldn't get any stranger, the very next morning, Fran recalled how 2 helicopters arrived. On board were some base game wardens and, in Fran's words, some other fellas. Fran admitted to Art that, to this day, he has no idea who these other men were that accompanied the game wardens. We were made to bring them back to the area where this happened. 2 of the individuals walked where we directed them, and we were ordered to leave the area. Not long after this, Fran learned that the entire wargame exercise had been cancelled. This was the first night of a 4-day wargame, and it was cancelled. This is something the Marine Corps does not do, to cancel a computerized wargame. It was over 3,000 Marines involved in this, and the logistics and the money that was spent on this, and it was cancelled.